Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Middle Ages everyone skips over, the awkward parts, the unglamorous parts, the things that were so normal back then nobody thought to write them down, which is honestly rude of them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. One of the biggest lies we tell ourselves about medieval people is that they stayed put. Born in one village, died in the same bed, never leaving the comforting radius of the local cow. In reality, medieval life was less rooted farming community and more permanent state of low-energy relocation. People moved constantly, usually not because they wanted to, but because something had gone horribly wrong. Crops failed, lords raised rents, armies marched through, ate everything, and left behind the medieval equivalent of a "sorry about that" note written in hoofprints. When this happened, peasants didn't complain. Complaining was dangerous. They packed. And by packed, I mean they grabbed whatever wasn't nailed down, argued over whether the cooking pot was worth carrying, and walked, not toward opportunity, toward maybe this place is slightly less cursed. Seasonal work added to the chaos. Harvest time pulled labourers across entire regions. Religious festivals triggered mass human migration, as thousands of people decided that walking for weeks to stand in a field and pray was a perfectly reasonable vacation plan. Pilgrimages were popular because nothing says spiritual growth like blistered feet and food poisoning. Travel itself was an experience. Roads were mud. Mud was everywhere. In winter you sank. In summer you choked on dust. Signposts were rare. Maps were optimistic lies. Getting lost wasn't an accident. It was the default setting. And yet people kept going. Because staying could be worse. If your lord suddenly remembered you existed and wanted more taxes, walking away might save your life. Medieval society liked to pretend people were legally bound to land forever. Reality quietly disagreed. Villages became revolving doors of humanity. New faces arrived. Old ones vanished. Nobody asked too many questions because tomorrow they might be the ones leaving under cover of darkness with a sack of grain and a growing sense of regret. Even gossip travelled faster than official news. A merchant with loose morals and a loud voice could spread rumours across half a kingdom faster than a royal messenger who actually knew what he was doing. So medieval people weren't static peasants trapped in time. They were tired, mobile survivors, constantly walking away from problems, usually straight into new ones. History draws borders. Medieval people walked right over them, slowly, complaining the entire way. Romance in the medieval world was heartfelt, emotional, and frequently outsourced. Because while people were deeply capable of falling in love, most of them were not capable of writing it down. Literacy was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for clergy, nobles, and that one guy in town who wouldn't stop correcting everyone. So when medieval people wanted to express affection, devotion, or uncontrollable longing, they hired a professional, a scribe, a clerk, sometimes a monk. Nothing kills the mood like whispering your deepest feelings to a man who has sworn celibacy and is judging your grammar. Picture the scene. You enter a small room that smells like ink, parchment, and quiet disappointment. You clear your throat and say something like, "I need a letter. A love letter." The scribe nods calmly, dips his quill and asks, "How intense are we talking?" Then comes the confession. You dictate your feelings out loud, slowly, carefully, while another human being writes down every word with the emotional distance of someone taking grocery notes. You say, "Tell her my heart burns for her." The scribe pauses, looks up and asks, "Burns as in spiritually, or burns as in alarming?" And of course, there were standards. Medieval love letters followed formal structures. There were opening praises, emotional declarations, vows of loyalty, and dramatic flourishes borrowed from classical texts. If you weren't eloquent enough, the scribe would help. Would you like to compare her beauty to the dawn, the rose, or divine light? This was not optional. Romance had formatting rules. And, even better, the scribe often knew both parties. Small towns didn't offer anonymity. Your love letter might be written by someone who baptized your crush, taught her cousin to read, and absolutely knew she was already engaged. Professional discretion was encouraged. Professional silence was hopeful. Sometimes scribes reused phrases, not intentionally. But when you write dozens of love letters a year, patterns happen. Somewhere out there, two medieval lovers received suspiciously similar compliments and never compared notes. And then there's delivery. Letters were carried by messengers, friends, or whoever owed you a favour. There was no privacy seal beyond wax and trust. Anyone handling it could read it, laugh, or memorise your romantic desperation for later entertainment. Yet somehow, despite all this, medieval love letters worked. People married. Affairs happened. Hearts were broken. Love survived quills, witnesses, reused metaphors, and monks with opinions. Romance wasn't private. It wasn't discreet, but it was sincere, even when dictated. And that might be the most medieval thing of all. In medieval society, being left-handed wasn't a harmless quirk. It was a red flag, a warning sign, a gentle suggestion from the universe that something about you was off. And by off, medieval people meant possibly cursed, morally suspicious, or one bad day away from witchcraft. The problem started with symbolism. The Latin word for left is sinister, which should tell you everything you need to know. Right-handedness was associated with order, righteousness, and divine favour. Left-handedness, meanwhile, was linked to chaos, deception, and doing things the wrong way. Literally. If you reached for something with your left hand, someone nearby probably frowned and quietly reconsidered trusting you. Left-handed children were often corrected early. And by corrected, I mean actively trained out of it. Teachers, parents, and religious figures encouraged right-hand use for writing, eating, praying, and basically existing. If you stubbornly favoured your left hand, it wasn't seen as preference. It was seen as defiance. Or worse, influence. Even daily rituals reinforced this bias. People crossed themselves with their right hand. Oaths were sworn with the right hand raised. Important actions happened on the right side. Doing something left-handed felt wrong in a way that was both social and spiritual. Medieval logic concluded that if the devil existed, and everyone agreed he did, he probably favoured the left. Left-handed knights had it especially rough. Sword training assumed right-handed combat. A left-handed fighter confused opponents, which sounds like an advantage until you realise your own instructors didn't like it. Being unpredictable was suspicious. Being effective, while unpredictable, was even worse. Medical theory didn't help either. Medieval scholars believed the body was divided into moral halves. The right side was strong, warm, and noble. The left side was weaker, colder, and prone to imbalance. If something went wrong physically, the left side was often blamed. Because of course it was. Despite all this, left-handed people persisted. They worked, fought, wrote, cooked, and survived quietly, using the hand that felt natural. Many simply learned to switch in public and revert in private, a medieval version of code switching but for hands. So if you were left-handed in the Middle Ages, congratulations. You weren't evil. You weren't cursed. You were just living in a world deeply offended by your coordination. History has many villains. Sometimes it turns out one of them was the left hand. In the medieval world, self-awareness existed. Self-reflection did not. At least not visually. Because for most people, mirrors were rare, expensive, and wildly impractical. Which means the average medieval peasant went through life with only a vague second-hand understanding of what their own face looked like. Glass mirrors were luxury items, owned by nobles, monasteries, or that one suspiciously wealthy merchant who never explained where his money came from. Polished metal mirrors existed, but they were small, dull, distorted. and often showed you a version of yourself that looked like it had been lightly cursed. Imagine finally seeing your reflection and realizing you appear permanently annoyed and slightly melted. For most people, the closest thing to a mirror was water. Ponds, wells, buckets, or rivers offered fleeting glimpses, usually warped by ripples, shadows, or the sudden realization that you might fall in and die. You didn't linger. You glanced. You accepted whatever vague shape stared back and moved on. As a result, medieval people learned what they looked like through descriptions. Other people told them, not kindly. You have your father's nose. Your eyes are too close together. You look tired. This was your mirror. Social feedback. Brutal, unfiltered, and unavoidable. This also meant personal grooming was approximate. Hairstyles were practical, not aesthetic. Beards were trimmed based on feel, not appearance. If your hair looked uneven, someone would eventually mention it, loudly, publicly, and with unnecessary enthusiasm. The idea of checking your appearance before leaving the house simply didn't exist. You left the house and hoped for the best. If no one laughed immediately, you assumed things were fine. Confidence was easier when you had no visual proof otherwise. Portraits didn't help either. Most people never had one. And even when they did, medieval art wasn't aiming for realism. Artists focused on symbolism, not accuracy. A portrait might show you looking serene, noble, and symmetrical, none of which were guaranteed in real life. This disconnect between identity and appearance created a strange freedom. Medieval people weren't obsessed with how they looked because they literally couldn't be. Vanity required access. Access required money. Most people had neither. So medieval society judged you by your actions, your reputation, your family, and whether you smelled tolerable, not by your jawline or skin tone. In a world without mirrors, self-esteem was built on survival, not selfies, and honestly, that might be the most medieval flex of all. One of the strangest and least discussed facts about medieval life is how emotionally attached people were to their stuff. Not in a modern consumerist way. There was no impulse buying, no seasonal upgrades, no treat-yourself mentality. When you owned something in the Middle Ages, it was because you needed it, and chances were you would own it for most of your life. Naturally, people started giving these objects names. Tools were the most common candidates. A shovel wasn't just a shovel, it was the shovel. The one that helped you survive winters, dig fields, bury relatives, and occasionally threaten geese. When something does that much emotional labour, it earns a name. Axes, ploughs, knives, and even cooking pots were often referred to as if they were co-workers rather than property. Weapons were especially personal. Swords, daggers, and shields frequently had names, sometimes serious, sometimes oddly affectionate. A blade that had protected you in battle wasn't metal. It was a companion. Breaking it wasn't inconvenient. It was tragic. People didn't say, "My sword snapped." They said, "I lost him." But it didn't stop there. Ovens were named. Doors were named. Bells were named. If an object was central to daily survival, it crossed the line from tool to personality. An oven that baked good bread was praised. One that failed was insulted. Loudly, repeatedly, in front of others. This wasn't superstition. It was practicality mixed with exhaustion. When your entire life depended on a handful of objects functioning properly, you developed relationships with them. You spoke to them. You blamed them. You thanked them. Medieval people lived close to the edge, and anthropomorphizing a shovel was healthier than screaming into the void. There was also a legal side. Named objects appeared in wills. I leave my good knife to my eldest son. Not just any knife, the good one. Everyone knew which one that meant. Objects carried memory, reputation, and history. Losing them was losing a piece of identity. Even repairs carried emotional weight. A patched tool wasn't inferior. It was experienced. Scars meant reliability. A tool that had been fixed a dozen times had proven it deserved to stay. In a world with very few possessions, each one mattered. So medieval people didn't just own objects. They lived with them, worked with them, and sometimes cursed them like old friends who refused to cooperate. Honestly, naming your shovel makes a lot of sense when your shovel is the reason you're still alive. In the medieval world, shoes were not fashion. They were not accessories. They were not something you casually owned 3 pairs of just in case. Shoes were survival equipment, and losing a shoe was less oops and more this might actually ruin my year. Leather was expensive. Skilled labor was expensive. Everything involved in making shoes required time, animals, and a cobbler who probably had strong opinions and limited patience. As a result, most people owned exactly 1 pair of shoes. 1. And those shoes were expected to endure fields, mud, stones, animal waste, winter frost, summer heat, and whatever mysterious liquids medieval streets offered without explanation. So instead of replacing shoes, people repaired them. Constantly. Soles were stitched, restitched, patched, layered, and reinforced until the original shoe was less footwear and more historical artifact. A medieval shoe could contain leather from 3 different animals, repairs from multiple decades, and enough stitching to qualify as a textile thesis. Cobblers were everywhere and deeply respected. Not glamorous, but essential. A good cobbler could extend the life of a shoe for years, sometimes decades, and if you found one who worked quickly and didn't judge you for the smell, you stayed loyal forever. Shoes were so valuable that they appeared in wills. Parents passed them down to children. Older siblings inherited shoes that had already seen too much. Breaking in new shoes wasn't painful because they were new. It was painful because they were someone else's old ones. And heaven help you if a shoe failed during winter. Bare feet on frozen ground wasn't inconvenient. It was dangerous. Frostbite didn't care about your financial situation. So people wrapped their feet in cloth, straw, or whatever material they could find until the cobbler could work his magic again. This also explains why medieval people walked the way they did. Carefully. Deliberately. Every step mattered. You didn't sprint unless chased by something worse than losing a shoe. You avoided puddles not for cleanliness, but for shoe preservation. In a world without cheap replacements, durability was everything. Shoes weren't discarded. They were managed, loved, maintained, argued with. So when you picture medieval life, remember this. Those worn-out, misshapen shoes weren't signs of poverty. They were signs of responsibility. If your shoes lasted, you were doing something right. One quiet fear haunted medieval life more than war, famine, or even disease. Being forgotten. Not dying. Dying was expected. Being erased. That was unbearable. In a world with no photographs, no recordings, and very little written documentation, memory was fragile. If no one remembered you, it was as if you had never existed. And medieval people were deeply uncomfortable with that idea. Eternity was long. Reputation was short. The math didn't work. This is why people obsessed over names. Children were named after parents, grandparents, saints, and occasionally that one uncle everyone agreed deserved another shot. Naming wasn't creative. It was archival. You weren't honouring someone. You were keeping them alive through repetition. Gravestones, when they existed, mattered enormously. Even the simplest marker, a carved symbol, a scratched name, a rough cross, was a declaration. I was here. I mattered enough to be remembered. If you couldn't afford stone, memory had to do the work instead. Stories became tombstones you carried in your head. This fear also explains why medieval people loved witnesses. Contracts were spoken aloud. Promises were made in groups. Events were public. If enough people saw something happen, it became real. If no one saw it, it might as well have never happened. Privacy wasn't romantic. It was risky. Church records existed partly for the same reason. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, all carefully logged, not just for God, but for memory. Being written down meant permanence. Being unwritten meant vanishing quietly into the mud of history. Even medieval charity had a memory angle. Donating to a church often came with one request: say my name in your prayers. That wasn't spiritual vanity, that was insurance. As long as someone spoke your name, you weren't gone. Ironically, this obsession worked. Centuries later, we still know the names of ordinary people because they were stubborn enough to leave marks, records, symbols, or stories behind. So medieval people didn't chase fame. They chased remembrance. They lived knowing their time was short, their world was unstable, and history was forgetful. And they fought that reality the only way they could, by making sure someone, somewhere, remembered their name. Which is why you're hearing about them now. In the modern world, silence is marketed as a luxury. People buy noise-cancelling headphones, book silent retreats, and proudly announce that they just need some quiet. Medieval people, on the other hand, heard silence and immediately assumed something had gone terribly, spiritually wrong. A silent medieval house was not peaceful. It was suspicious. Noise meant life. Talking, coughing, praying, animals shuffling, tools clanking. These were reassuring sounds. If a home went quiet, it suggested illness, death, or the presence of something that preferred you not notice it. And medieval people were very uncomfortable with things that preferred not to be noticed. This fear had religious roots. Silence was associated with the grave, the afterlife, and the unknown. Churches echoed on purpose, filling space with chanting, bells, and prayer. Bells rang constantly, for timekeeping, warnings, celebrations, funerals, emergencies, and sometimes just because someone thought the silence was getting ideas. Homes followed the same logic. People talked while they worked. They sang while they cooked. They prayed out loud. Even alone, many people muttered to themselves, not because they were strange, but because being audibly present felt safer. Silence implied abandonment. Sound implied protection. At night, silence was especially dangerous. Darkness already belonged to spirits, demons, and theological anxiety. Add silence, and you had a perfect environment for imagining footsteps, whispers, or divine judgment creeping up behind you. A crackling fire, even a weak one, was comforting not just for warmth but for sound. That gentle noise reassured you that the world was still functioning. This also explains medieval group sleeping habits. People didn't just sleep together for warmth. They slept together because shared breathing, shifting, and occasional snoring created a soundscape that pushed back the void. A room full of noise meant no one had died quietly during the night, which was always a concern. Even monasteries, famous for silence, structured it carefully. Silence wasn't absence of sound. It was regulated, ritualized, and heavily supervised. Unplanned silence? That was unsettling. To medieval ears, silence wasn't calm. It wasn't healing. It wasn't restful. It was a warning. And in a world where danger was constant and explanations were limited, making noise was one of the easiest ways to feel alive. So if medieval people seemed loud, repetitive, or annoyingly chatty, remember, they weren't filling space. They were keeping it away. In medieval society, hair wasn't just hair. It was a statement, a warning, a resume, and occasionally a problem that needed immediate spiritual intervention. What grew out of your head mattered far more than modern people would be comfortable with, because medieval culture believed hair carried meaning, moral, social, and sometimes supernatural. Long hair could signal power, freedom, or rebellion. It could also signal that you hadn't been properly punished yet. Knights wore their hair with intention. Nobles styled it to display status. Monks shaved it to prove devotion. And women's hair, that was treated like a dangerous substance best kept under control at all times. Loose hair on a woman was associated with sexuality, disorder, or emotional instability. Respectable women covered their hair not because it was cold, but because medieval society was deeply nervous about what might happen if it wasn't restrained. Hair escaping a veil was treated like a scandal in progress. Hair cutting itself was symbolic. Having your hair cut against your will was a punishment, a public removal of dignity. Criminals, prisoners, and disgraced individuals often had their hair shaved to mark shame. It wasn't just humiliation. It was identity theft. You didn't look like yourself anymore, and everyone knew why. Religious life took hair seriously too. Monks shaved the crown of the head in the famous tonsure, creating a bald circle that silently announced, "I belong to God now." This haircut required maintenance, which meant monks were constantly reshaving the same awkward bald spot, just in case God was checking. Even beards carried meaning. A beard could symbolize wisdom, masculinity, or authority. Shaving one off could be an insult, a challenge, or an emotional declaration. Medieval men didn't shave casually. They shaved with intent. And then there was the fear of hair falling into the wrong hands. Hair could be used in charms, curses, or folk magic. People believed strands carried part of your essence. Losing hair wasn't cosmetic. It was risky. Throwing it away carelessly was an invitation for someone with bad intentions and too much free time. So medieval people guarded their hair, controlled it, shaped it, and judged others by it relentlessly. Hair wasn't decoration. It wasn't personal expression. It was power sitting on your scalp, daring you to manage it correctly. And if you didn't, someone would definitely have an opinion. Medieval people did not believe all days were created equal. Some days were blessed, productive, and spiritually cooperative. Others were suspicious, deeply suspicious. And if you did anything important on the wrong day, medieval logic concluded that whatever went wrong was entirely your fault for not checking the calendar first. These unlucky days weren't rare. They were everywhere. Certain weekdays, saints' days, feast days, fasting days, astrological alignments, and vague, traditionally bad dates were all considered dangerous for specific activities. There were days you should not marry, days you should not travel, days you should not bleed, days you should not plant crops, and days you should absolutely not cut your hair, because apparently hair remembers things. Medical guides warned against procedures on the wrong days. If you were sick, it mattered when you sought treatment. Bleeding a patient on the wrong date wasn't just ineffective, it was reckless. Surgeons consulted calendars before touching you, which is comforting in theory, until you realize the calendar was based on astrology, vibes, and inherited superstition. Farmers followed the same logic. Planting on an unlucky day risked poor harvests, storms, or divine disapproval. If crops failed later, no one blamed the weather. They blamed the date. Somewhere, a calendar quietly nodded in judgment. Marriage was especially complicated. Choosing the wrong wedding day could doom a relationship before it even began. Couples delayed ceremonies for weeks to avoid cursed dates. Imagine explaining to your family that you love each other deeply, but the stars are currently unsupportive. Even travel had unlucky days. Setting out on the wrong morning meant accidents, bandits, broken carts, or mysterious misfortune. Some people would turn back if they experienced a bad omen, tripping, sneezing, hearing the wrong bird, because clearly the universe was saying, "Not today." The irony is that this belief created its own consequences. When people expected bad outcomes, they noticed them more. A bad day became bad because everyone treated it like it was already ruined. Medieval self-fulfilling prophecy was thriving. Calendars became survival manuals. Knowing which days were safe meant control in an unpredictable world. If disaster struck, at least you could say, "Well, I warned you about that Tuesday." So medieval people didn't just plan their lives. They negotiated with time itself, and time, more often than not, was deeply unimpressed. In medieval times, a sneeze was not a minor inconvenience. It was an event, a moment, a potential spiritual emergency that required immediate verbal intervention from everyone nearby. Because to medieval people, sneezing wasn't just air leaving your body, it was your soul briefly considering an escape. The logic was simple and deeply unsettling. Sneezing created a moment of vulnerability. Your body convulsed, your breath stopped, your eyes closed, and for a split second, you lost control. And any moment where you lost control was clearly an invitation for spirits, demons, or general bad luck to either leave you or move in. Medieval theology did not trust gaps. This is where blessings came in. Saying God bless you wasn't politeness. It was damage control, a spoken seal, a quick spiritual lid slammed shut before anything invisible and malicious could take advantage of the situation. If no one blessed you after a sneeze, that was alarming. It meant your soul might be unsupervised. Sneezing during important moments was especially concerning. A sneeze during prayer? Suspicious. A sneeze during a wedding? Unfortunate. A sneeze while making a vow or signing a contract? Potentially catastrophic. Some people would stop what they were doing entirely, wait for the moment to pass, and only then continue, because clearly the universe had tried to interrupt. Medical beliefs made it worse. Some medieval thinkers believed sneezing expelled air directly connected to the heart or brain. Too many sneezes meant weakness. Too few sneezes meant blockage. Sneezing the wrong way meant imbalance. Sneezing at the wrong time meant fate was speaking, and fate was rarely helpful. There were even interpretations based on direction. Sneezing to the right could be good. Sneezing to the left was questionable. Sneezing repeatedly meant something was very wrong and possibly involved curses, drafts, or both. Children were warned not to sneeze carelessly, which is impressive because sneezing is famously easy to control. Parents scolded kids for not covering their mouths, not for hygiene, but because open sneezing increased spiritual exposure. Medieval parenting was wild, and yet sneezing was unavoidable. Everyone did it, which meant medieval life was filled with constant low-level anxiety that your nose might betray you at the worst possible moment. So when someone blessed you after a sneeze, it wasn't kindness, it was panic wrapped in courtesy. A medieval sneeze wasn't rude, it was risky. Medieval childhood was not a long, reflective phase filled with self-discovery, toys, and carefully scheduled playdates. It was brief, brutally brief. In fact, medieval parents looked at a child and asked only one real question: can this small human be useful yet? If the answer was yes, congratulations, welcome to the workforce. As soon as a child could walk without falling directly into a fire or a bucket, they were assigned tasks. Small ones at first. Fetching water, carrying sticks, scaring birds away from crops by yelling enthusiastically and flailing their arms like confused scarecrows. None of this was seen as cruel. It was normal. A household was a survival unit, and everyone participated, regardless of height. By the time a child reached what we would now call early childhood, they were already competent contributors. Boys and girls alike herded animals, gathered fuel, helped with planting, cleaned tools, watched siblings, and learned trades simply by being present while adults worked. Education wasn't separate from labour. Labour was education. There were no job interviews, no training programs, no safety instructions. You learned by doing, or by watching someone else do it, or by making a mistake and not making it again if you survived. Childhood injuries weren't milestones. They were lessons. Parents didn't romanticize childhood innocence because survival didn't allow for it. Love was expressed through teaching usefulness. A capable child was a protected child. If you could work, you were valuable. If you were valuable, you were fed. This didn't mean medieval parents were heartless. They worried constantly. They protected when they could. They told stories, sang songs, and laughed with their children in rare quiet moments. But the expectation was clear. Childhood was preparation, not pause. Teenagers were already adults in practice. Many were apprenticed out, sent to other households, or working full days long before modern society would allow them near anything sharp. By their early teens, many medieval children were already tired in a way most modern adults would recognize. Play existed, but it was squeezed between responsibilities. Games involved sticks, stones, animals, or pretending to be someone important, which usually meant pretending not to be poor. So medieval parents didn't ask their children what they wanted to be when they grew up. They asked what they could do today. And honestly, that expectation shaped generations of survivors, whether they liked it or not. In the medieval world, signing your name was not a basic life skill. It was a flex. Literacy was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for clergy, nobles, and that one irritating town official who insisted on reading things aloud slowly. For everyone else, identity worked a little differently. Instead of signatures, medieval people used symbols. When peasants, merchants, or craftsmen needed to confirm a contract, they didn't sign their name. They made a mark. A cross was the most common, but many people had personal symbols, simple shapes, lines, or marks they used consistently. That symbol was you. It carried legal weight. It said, "Yes, I agree," even if you couldn't read a single word of what you were agreeing to, which, to be clear, happened constantly. Contracts were often read aloud by a clerk, while everyone nodded solemnly, pretending to understand. Then you made your mark and hoped the nice man with the ink wasn't quietly transferring your cow, your land, and your dignity to someone else. These symbols weren't random. They became part of a person's identity. People recognized them the way we recognize signatures today. A familiar mark meant trust. A sloppy or unfamiliar one raised suspicion. Forging a mark was a crime, which is impressive, considering the mark might just be a crooked line. Shop signs worked the same way. Since many people couldn't read, businesses identified themselves with pictures: a boot for a cobbler, a key for a locksmith, a barrel for a tavern. You didn't need words, you needed recognition. Medieval branding was aggressively visual. Even noble families used symbols: coats of arms, seals, crests. These weren't decoration, they were legal tools. A wax seal stamped with a family symbol could validate a document without anyone needing to read it. Break the seal, and you broke trust. This system worked surprisingly well. It allowed a largely illiterate society to function with contracts, trade, and law through shared visual language. Identity wasn't spelled out, it was shown. So medieval people didn't sign their name because they couldn't. They marked themselves because that was enough. In a world built on memory, reputation, and witnesses, a simple symbol could carry the weight of your entire life. Death in the medieval world was common, familiar, and deeply unsettling. Not just because people died young, but because nobody was entirely sure when someone was actually dead. Medical knowledge was limited, diagnostic tools were non-existent, and "are they breathing?" was the gold standard of confirmation. This uncertainty created one of medieval society's quiet, persistent fears: being buried alive. Comas, fainting, hypothermia, shock, and illness could all mimic death. If someone stopped moving, breathing shallowly, or responding, the conclusion was often made quickly, especially during plagues, winters, or famines when bodies needed to be dealt with fast. And yes, mistakes happened. Stories circulated of coffins being opened later with scratch marks inside, of bodies discovered, twisted, moved, or clearly panicked. Whether all of these stories were true or slightly exaggerated didn't matter. The fear was real, and it spread. As a result, medieval people developed contingency plans. Some requested delayed burials, insisting their body be watched for days. Wakes weren't just social rituals, they were observation periods. If you moved, twitched, or made an alarming noise, congratulations, you were not dead yet. Others asked to be buried with objects. Bells, ropes, or signals weren't widespread until later periods, but the idea was there. People worried. They planned. They negotiated with death like it was a slightly unreliable employee. This fear also affected burial practices. Graves were shallow. Coffins were simple. In some cases, bodies were buried directly in the ground, which was horrifying in its own way, but at least made escape theoretically possible. The bar was low. Religious belief made things worse. Being buried alive wasn't just terrifying, it risked dying without proper rites. No confession, no final prayers, no clean spiritual exit. That possibility haunted people far more than physical discomfort. So medieval people didn't just fear death, they feared premature certainty. They feared silence mistaken for stillness. They feared sleep mistaken for eternity. And in a world where the line between life and death was thin, blurred, and poorly lit, that fear made uncomfortable sense. It's easy to imagine medieval life as an endless parade of suffering. Dirt, disease, danger, and despair stacked neatly on top of one another, like a historical misery sandwich. And yes, life was hard. Painfully hard. But what often gets lost is that medieval people weren't walking around in a constant state of despair, clutching their heads and waiting for the next disaster to arrive on schedule. Most days were ordinary, and ordinary medieval life was quietly absurd. People laughed, they joked, they gossiped, they complained about neighbours, weather, prices, and authority, enthusiastically. Medieval humour was blunt, crude, and extremely unfiltered. Marginal doodles in manuscripts include fart jokes, animals wearing clothes, monks doing questionable things, and drawings that raise deeply uncomfortable questions about the artist's state of mind. Festivals existed everywhere. Saints' days, feast days, market days. Any excuse to stop working, eat too much, drink something questionable, and forget responsibilities for a while was embraced. People danced badly. They sang loudly. They mocked authority figures with jokes that were just subtle enough to avoid punishment. Even hardship had routine. Famine wasn't a constant emergency. It was something people planned around. Illness was frightening, but familiar. Death was present, but not paralyzing. When everything is dangerous, you adapt emotionally or you don't survive. Absurdity became a coping mechanism, naming tools, believing sneezes were dangerous, avoiding unlucky days, arguing with ovens, assigning personalities to objects. None of this meant medieval people were foolish. It meant they were human in a world that offered very little certainty. They found meaning in ritual, comfort in repetition, humour in exaggeration. When you can't control much, you control how you react, and medieval people reacted with creativity, stubbornness, and occasional nonsense. So medieval life wasn't a constant tragedy. It was a long improvisation, a mix of fear and familiarity, hardship and habit, serious beliefs and deeply unserious behaviour. People weren't waiting to be saved by progress. They were living, day by day, inside a system that made sense to them, even when it looks ridiculous to us. History remembers wars and plagues, but medieval people remember themselves through laughter, ritual, and resilience. And that's the part nobody talks about, because it doesn't fit the myth. In Tudor England, beauty was not a private matter, nor was it something a woman could define for herself. It was a public expectation, closely watched and quietly enforced. The ideal Tudor woman was meant to look a certain way, behave a certain way, and above all, signal virtue without ever speaking it aloud. Beauty functioned less as decoration and more as evidence. Evidence of obedience, status, and moral reliability. Pale skin sat at the top of this hierarchy. A fair complexion suggested that a woman did not work outdoors, that she belonged to an indoor world of tapestries, prayers, and supervision. Darkness of skin implied labour, exposure, and therefore a dangerous proximity to independence. The sun, after all, was for peasants. Noble women protected themselves from it with veils, powders, and wide sleeves, turning pallor into a visible badge of class. To look healthy was acceptable. To look robust was not. Softness mattered just as much. A Tudor woman was expected to appear physically delicate, even if she was not. Rounded features, smooth hands, and gentle movements were prized because they suggested a life untouched by strain. Strength, even when necessary, had to be carefully hidden. A woman who appeared too capable risked seeming unfeminine, and unfeminine women were treated with suspicion. Silence completed the image. The ideal woman spoke quietly, sparingly, and only when invited. Wit was admired in men and tolerated in queens. In ordinary women, it was risky. A sharp tongue could easily be mistaken for ambition. and ambition in women was framed as a moral flaw. Chastity, therefore, was not only about sexual behavior. It extended to speech, posture, laughter, and even facial expression. A woman who smiled too freely or met eyes too directly could find her reputation questioned without a single accusation being spoken. What made this ideal particularly cruel was its impossibility. Women were expected to embody purity, obedience, and beauty, while also serving as symbols of family honor and dynastic worth. Any failure, a blemish, a rumor, a moment of assertiveness, reflected not just on the woman herself, but on the men who claimed authority over her. In Tudor society, beauty was not a gift, it was a responsibility. And like all responsibilities placed on women of the period, it came with consequences for getting it wrong. If the ideal Tudor woman was supposed to look effortlessly pure, the reality required a great deal of effort and a surprising amount of chemistry. Cosmetics were both widely used and publicly condemned, creating a strange contradiction. Women were expected to appear flawless, yet criticized for doing anything that helped them achieve it. Beauty had to look natural, even when it absolutely was not. Face whitening was the most common practice. Pale skin could be enhanced with powders made from chalk, lead, or vinegar mixtures. These substances brightened the complexion and hid blemishes, but they also poisoned the skin over time. Teeth loosened, hair fell out, and faces developed sores beneath the smooth surface. Still, the risk was considered acceptable. In a society obsessed with appearances, visible decay was less threatening than visible imperfection. Rouge was used more carefully. A slight flush on the cheeks suggested youth and vitality, but too much colour hinted at sexual availability. The line between health and impropriety was thin and constantly shifting. Lip colour faced similar scrutiny. Red lips could signify beauty or moral danger depending on who was doing the judging, and when. What mattered most was plausibility. A woman had to look as though nature had simply been kinder to her than to others. Hair was another battlefield. Fair hair was idealized, associated with innocence and nobility. Women lightened their hair using herbal rinses, sunlight, or alkaline solutions, sometimes damaging it beyond repair. Wigs and hairpieces were common, though rarely admitted to. Once again, the illusion mattered more than the truth beneath it. The real anxiety around cosmetics came from fear of deception. A painted face was thought to mislead men, disguise age, and distort social hierarchies. Moralists argued that cosmetics allowed women to lie with their appearance, a dangerous power in a world where marriages were strategic and lineage mattered deeply. A beautiful woman who turned out to be older, weaker, or less fertile than expected was treated not as unfortunate, but as fraudulent. Yet these same critics rarely offered an alternative. Women were judged harshly for visible flaws and punished socially for failing to meet aesthetic expectations. Cosmetics were condemned as dishonest, but refusing to use them could be just as damaging. The choice was never truly a choice. In Tudor England, beauty rituals were a gamble. They promised social survival while quietly eroding health and safety. A woman's face became a carefully maintained mask, not to express identity, but to avoid suspicion, gossip, and judgment in a world that watched her constantly. In Tudor England, beauty was not merely admired, it was assessed. A woman's appearance played a central role in marriage negotiations, where looks functioned as a form of currency. Families did not simply hope their daughters would marry well. They evaluated, marketed, and sometimes quietly worried about how much a daughter's face and body might be worth in social terms. Youth mattered above all else. A young bride promised fertility, obedience, and adaptability. Signs of age, even minor ones, reduced marital value sharply. Wrinkles, thinning hair, or a tired expression could shift a family's prospects. As a result, girls were often married early, before age could complicate negotiations. Beauty was something to be leveraged quickly, before it faded or was questioned. Physical symmetry and health were closely scrutinized. Strong teeth, clear skin, and balanced features suggested good breeding and reliable childbearing. Defects, illnesses, or visible scars raised fears of weak offspring or hidden moral flaws. The body became a resume, silently read by prospective husbands and their families. Love rarely entered the discussion. What mattered was suitability, alliance, and reputation. Dowries worked alongside appearance, but they did not replace it. A wealthy family might compensate for plain looks with land or money, but beauty could amplify a modest dowry dramatically. In some cases, appearance determined whether negotiations happened at all. A woman deemed unattractive might never be formally considered, regardless of her intelligence or character. Silence followed, rather than rejection, which was often more painful. For women, this process encouraged constant self-surveillance. Posture, speech, dress, and expression were refined to enhance appeal without seeming deliberate. A woman who appeared too eager risked seeming desperate. One who appeared indifferent risked seeming cold or difficult. Every gesture was calculated to present compliance, fertility, and moral reliability in equal measure. Once married, beauty did not lose its importance. A wife was expected to remain attractive to secure her husband's affection and loyalty, especially in elite households where mistresses were common. A decline in appearance could invite comparison, humiliation, or abandonment. Beauty became maintenance work, a lifelong obligation rather than a temporary advantage. In this system, appearance was power, but fragile power. It could open doors, shape alliances, and improve a family's fortunes. Yet it also reduced women to surfaces, judged before they spoke, and remembered primarily for how they looked when they were young. Marriage, in the Tudor world, did not free women from aesthetic judgment. It simply made the stakes permanent. If ordinary Tudor women were judged quietly, queens were judged relentlessly. Their bodies were no longer private or symbolic. They were political assets. Every feature, every change in appearance, and every rumour surrounding a queen's body carried implications for the stability of the realm. Beauty, fertility, and behaviour were fused into a single public obsession. A queen's appearance mattered from the moment marriage negotiations began. Portraits were exchanged like diplomatic tools, carefully adjusted to flatter and reassure. These images were not meant to deceive so much as to promise. A beautiful queen suggested a fruitful marriage, healthy heirs, and divine favour. If reality failed to match the image, disappointment quickly turned to suspicion. Once crowned, queens lived under constant scrutiny. Weight gain, weight loss, illness, or exhaustion were interpreted as signs of pregnancy, infertility, or moral failure. The queen's body became a public text, endlessly read and reinterpreted. When pregnancies succeeded, her beauty was celebrated as proof of legitimacy. When they failed, whispers followed, often blaming her appearance, habits, or supposed inadequacies. Queens were also expected to embody contradictory ideals. They had to appear fertile yet modest, commanding yet gentle, splendid yet restrained. Clothing played a crucial role. Rich fabrics and jewels demonstrated royal authority, while excessive display risked accusations of vanity or moral looseness. Even colour choices carried meaning. White suggested purity. Red could signal power or danger depending on context. There was no neutral option. The pressure intensified with failure. Anne Boleyn's body was scrutinised after each miscarriage, her changing appearance cited as evidence of divine disfavour. Catherine of Aragon's ageing body became a political problem, used to justify her replacement. Jane Seymour's brief reign was framed almost entirely around her ability to produce a male heir, after which her body was no longer discussed, because it was no longer useful. Even Elizabeth I, who ruled without marrying, could not escape this surveillance. Her carefully controlled image balanced youth, chastity, and authority long after reality made this impossible. Cosmetics, wigs, and symbolic portraiture allowed her to rule through an image that defied time itself. Her beauty became a political performance, maintained to reassure subjects and intimidate rivals. In Tudor England, Queens were not allowed to age, weaken, or change in peace. Their bodies belonged to the state. Beauty elevated them, but it also trapped them, transforming flesh into policy and appearance into a matter of national security. In Tudor England, a woman's beauty was assumed to have an expiration date. Youth was celebrated, maturity tolerated, and aging quietly feared. While men were allowed to grow into authority, wisdom, and respect, women were expected to preserve the appearance of youth long after it naturally faded. Aging was not treated as a normal process, but as a personal failure. The physical signs of age carried social consequences. Wrinkles, thinning hair, weight changes, and dental decay were read as evidence of declining worth. An older woman's beauty was rarely reinterpreted as dignity or experience. Instead, she risked becoming invisible or worse, suspicious. Youth suggested fertility and obedience. Age suggested independence, memory, and influence, qualities that made Tudor society uneasy. This anxiety was especially strong among elite women. Their value had often rested on marriage prospects and fertility, both of which diminished with age. Once a woman passed childbearing years, her social leverage weakened dramatically. Widows could sometimes reclaim authority through wealth or family connections, but even then, their appearance remained a point of commentary. A widow who dressed too richly risked ridicule. One who dressed too plainly risked irrelevance. Cosmetics, wigs, and fashion became tools of resistance. Older women used them not only to preserve beauty, but to delay social disappearance. The same practices condemned in younger women were quietly tolerated in older ones, so long as they maintained decorum. The illusion of youth, even a fragile one, was preferable to visible aging. Yet this effort was emotionally exhausting. Women lived with constant awareness that time worked against them. Every year carried the risk of becoming less desirable, less influential, and less protected. Aging women were often caricatured as bitter, lustful, or manipulative, stereotypes that justified their marginalization. The feared figure of the old woman hovered at the edge of Tudor culture, a warning of what happened when beauty no longer shielded femininity. For queens and noblewomen, aging carried political danger. A queen past her fertile years could be seen as a dead end for dynastic hopes. Advisors and rivals watched closely for signs of decline, using appearance as a proxy for usefulness. Elizabeth I's elaborate visual control was a response to this fear. She refused to allow age to become visible because visibility invited challenge. In Tudor England, aging stripped women of the protection beauty provided. What remained was vulnerability. Unless a woman could replace beauty with authority, wealth, or careful invisibility. Beauty granted power briefly. Time reclaimed it relentlessly. In Tudor England, a woman's appearance was never morally neutral. Beauty attracted admiration, but it also invited suspicion. A woman who was noticeably beautiful risked being seen not as fortunate, but as dangerous. Her looks were interpreted as tools, either deliberately sharpened or divinely suspect, capable of leading men astray. This suspicion was rooted in long-standing religious and cultural beliefs. Female beauty was associated with temptation, deception, and disorder. Sermons and moral tracts warned that a woman's face could unman a man, distract him from duty, and pull him towards sin. Beauty, therefore, was not simply something a woman possessed. It was something she was expected to control for the sake of others. When scandals occurred, appearance often shaped blame. If a woman was accused of adultery, manipulation, or ambition, her beauty was cited as evidence. Attractive women were assumed to be more sexually available and morally unstable. Plain women, by contrast, were often ignored rather than condemned. Beauty made women visible, and visibility made them vulnerable. This dynamic played out brutally at court. Anne Boleyn's charm and elegance were reframed as seduction, once her political usefulness ended. Her intelligence became cunning. Her confidence became arrogance. Her beauty, once praised, was recast as proof of her ability to corrupt the king. The same qualities that elevated her were later used to justify her destruction. Even outside the court, moral suspicion followed women closely. A woman who dressed well risked accusations of vanity. One who attracted attention risked gossip. Beauty demanded constant self-policing. A woman had to appear attractive enough to fulfill social expectations, yet modest enough to avoid provoking envy or desire. The margin for error was narrow. Cosmetics intensified this suspicion. Painted faces were associated with lies, foreign influence, and even witchcraft. A woman who altered her appearance could be accused of hiding her true nature, as though physical enhancement revealed moral rot beneath the surface. The fear was not only that women might deceive men, but that they might enjoy doing so. In this environment, beauty became a liability as much as an asset. Women learned to deflect attention, minimize praise, and downplay their looks in public speech. Compliments were met with denial. Admiration was treated as a risk rather than a reward. Tudor society admired beauty in theory, but distrusted it in practice. For women, being beautiful meant living under suspicion, praised when useful, condemned when convenient, and always one rumour away from disgrace. Tudor beauty ideals were not created by women, nor were they maintained for women's benefit. They functioned within a system that tied female appearance directly to male authority. A woman's body and face were treated as reflections of the men who governed her father, her husband, or her king. Beauty, therefore, was not self-expression. It was a public statement about male control. A well-presented woman suggested a well-ordered household. Her modest dress and composed demeanour implied that a man was successfully managing his domestic sphere. If a woman appeared too bold, too lavish, or too visible, it reflected poorly on the men responsible for her. Her appearance became evidence in an unspoken evaluation of masculine competence. This dynamic explains why men regulated female beauty so closely. Sumptuary laws restricted what women could wear based on class, ensuring that appearance reinforced hierarchy. Hairstyles, fabrics, jewellery, and even sleeve widths were subject to scrutiny. These rules were less about taste and more about containment. Women were not meant to confuse social boundaries through appearance. At court, this control intensified. Courtiers understood that a woman's visibility could translate into influence. A beautiful woman attracted attention. Attention created access. Access created power. For men competing for favour, controlling how women appeared and how they were perceived became a political strategy. Praise could elevate, rumour could destroy. Male anxiety also shaped the ideal of silence. A woman who spoke too much disrupted the visual order men tried to maintain. Words introduced unpredictability. Beauty, by contrast, could be admired, judged, and contained. A quiet woman was easier to read, easier to manage, and easier to place within existing hierarchies. Yet this system was unstable. Men relied on women's beauty to advance family interests while fearing its effects. They encouraged attractiveness but punished autonomy. A woman who understood the power of her appearance and used it intentionally risked accusations of manipulation. Ignorance was safer than awareness. Even queens were subject to this logic. Elizabeth I carefully shaped her image to assert authority without threatening masculine norms too directly. Her beauty was symbolic, controlled, and framed as service to the state rather than personal ambition. She mastered the system by appearing to submit to it. In Tudor England, female beauty was never simply about women. It was a language men used to measure control, maintain hierarchy, and negotiate power with one another. Women bore the consequences, but the system served male insecurity as much as male dominance. Despite the restrictions placed on them, Tudor women were not passive subjects of beauty culture. Within narrow limits, they learned to adapt, negotiate, and occasionally resist. Open defiance was rare and dangerous, but subtle manipulation of appearance offered one of the few available forms of agency. Clothing became a tool of careful signalling. While sumptuary laws defined what women should wear, enforcement was uneven. Women pushed boundaries through fabric quality, embroidery, and accessories that technically complied while still attracting attention. A sleeve cut slightly wider, a richer shade of dye, or a carefully chosen jewel could communicate status and ambition without open violation. The message was visible to those who knew how to read it. Cosmetics, too, could function as quiet resistance. Though condemned in moral discourse, they allowed women to control how they were perceived in a society that valued appearance above honesty. Whitening the face, softening features, or disguising age-delayed social consequences. This was not vanity so much as survival. A woman who looked acceptable was safer than one who looked honest. Speech and demeanour offered similar strategies. Women learned when to remain silent and when to speak indirectly. Compliments were deflected. Praise was reframed as obligation. Confidence was masked as humility. These performances allowed women to participate in social life without triggering accusations of arrogance or ambition. It was a form of constant negotiation rather than submission. Some women exploited beauty expectations deliberately. Ladies at court understood how attention functioned. A carefully timed appearance, a controlled display of elegance, or a strategic absence could influence outcomes without formal authority. Influence rarely left records, but its effects were felt. Beauty could open doors that rank alone could not. Even Elizabeth I's image can be read as resistance as much as conformity. She refused marriage, controlled her representation obsessively, and used beauty symbolically rather than personally. Her face became an icon, not a vulnerability. By turning herself into an image, she avoided becoming a possession. Resistance in Tudor England was rarely loud. It was encoded in fabric, gesture, timing, and silence. Women did not reject beauty standards outright, but they learned to maneuver within them, bending expectations without breaking them. The system remained intact, but it was never as simple or as total as it pretended to be. Beauty constrained Tudor women, but it also gave them tools. Used carefully, appearance could protect, influence, and occasionally subvert the very rules meant to confine them. By the end of the Tudor period, one truth remained clear. Beauty was never neutral. It offered women access, visibility, and influence, but it also placed them under constant judgment. What appeared to be power was often conditional, temporary, and easily revoked. Beauty elevated women only so long as it served political, familial, or moral expectations. For some, appearance opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. Beauty could secure a favourable marriage, attract royal attention, or grant social mobility. At court, it created proximity to power. Yet this access came at a cost. The same qualities that brought admiration also made women vulnerable to gossip, suspicion, and punishment. Beauty did not protect women from control. It intensified it. The danger lay in how quickly praise could turn into blame. A woman celebrated for her elegance one year could be condemned for vanity the next. Changes in fortune, politics, or male favour reshaped how her appearance was interpreted. Beauty was praised when useful and condemned when inconvenient. Women had little control over this shift. Unlike wealth or title, beauty was unstable. It faded with age, illness, or childbirth. Tudor society offered no reliable alternative source of value for women once appearance declined. Authority, wisdom, and experience were rarely allowed to replace youth and physical appeal. For many women, beauty was their most visible asset, and their most fragile one. Queens demonstrated this contradiction most clearly. Their beauty symbolized legitimacy, fertility, and divine approval, yet bound them to impossible standards. Elizabeth I's reign proved that mastery of image could sustain power, but only through relentless control and sacrifice. Her success was exceptional precisely because the system was stacked against women. For ordinary women, the stakes were quieter, but no less real. Appearance shaped reputation, marriage prospects, and daily treatment. Beauty offered leverage, but demanded constant performance. Failure, whether through aging, illness, or rumour, carried consequences that could not easily be reversed. In the Tudor world, beauty functioned as both currency and cage. It allowed women limited movement within rigid structures, but never true freedom. The power it offered was real, yet precarious. And for most women, the cost of maintaining that power was lifelong vigilance in a society that never stopped watching. The Isthmian Games took place on one of the most strategically important strips of land in the ancient Greek world. The Isthmus of Corinth was a narrow bridge between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese, a place where land routes met sea lanes and where movement never truly stopped. Ships passed on either side, hauled across the land or docked nearby, while merchants, sailors, envoys and travellers flowed through Corinth every day. When the Isthmian Games began, this constant motion intensified rather than paused. The festival was held in honour of Poseidon, the god who ruled the seas, shook the earth, and governed horses. For Corinth, this was not symbolic worship. Poseidon was the god who protected their ships, their harbours, and their wealth. His sanctuary lay just outside the city, surrounded by pine trees and open ground, close enough to feel connected to Corinth's power, yet distant enough to be sacred. During the Games, this space became the heart of the Greek world. Unlike the Olympic Games, which required a long journey inland and weeks of travel, the Isthmian Games were easy to reach. This accessibility shaped their character. Sailors could attend between voyages. Traders could combine business with spectacle. Diplomats arrived knowing they would encounter rivals and allies in one place. The Games were pan-Hellenic, but they felt practical, busy, and alive. Athletic competition was only one part of the event. Religious rites opened the festival, with sacrifices made to Poseidon and processions moving through the sanctuary. The smell of burning offerings mixed with sea air. Victories were framed not just as physical triumphs, but as signs of divine favour. To win at Corinth was to impress both gods and men. The setting mattered deeply. Surrounded by trade routes and wealth, the Isthmian Games became a place where reputation could be built quickly. Athletes gained fame, cities advertised power, and individuals sought recognition beyond their local communities. Poets recited verses, musicians performed, and philosophers found audiences among the crowds. Even those who did not compete found ways to be seen. The Isthmian Games were not a retreat from everyday life. They amplified it. Held between two seas, they turned movement, competition, and ambition into ritual, proving that in ancient Greece, sacred celebration and worldly success often occupied the same space. At the centre of the Isthmian Games stood Poseidon, a god whose authority matched Corinth's ambitions. Unlike Zeus, who ruled from distant heights, Poseidon was immediate and unpredictable. He commanded the seas that fed Corinth's trade, the earthquakes that could destroy cities without warning, and the horses that symbolized speed, prestige, and control. Honouring him was not optional. It was a matter of survival. The Games began with ritual, not sport. Before any contest took place, sacrifices were offered at Poseidon's sanctuary. Bulls, rams, and other animals were presented at the altar, their blood sealing the bond between god and community. These rites reminded participants that victory did not come from strength alone. Divine favour mattered, and neglecting it invited disaster. For Corinth, hosting the Games was an act of political theology. By overseeing Poseidon's festival, the city claimed a special relationship with the god. This association reinforced Corinth's maritime identity and justified its influence across Greek trade networks. The Games quietly advertised Corinth as both wealthy and protected, a city under divine watch. Athletes understood this dynamic well. Many dedicated their participation to Poseidon before competing, offering prayers, small votive gifts, or vows in exchange for success. A win was more than personal glory. It was proof that the god had noticed you. Dedications filled the sanctuary. Helmets, tripods, statues, and inscriptions, each marking a moment when human effort met divine approval. The sacred nature of the Games also imposed rules. Warfare was discouraged during the festival, and safe passage was expected for travellers. While this truce was not always honoured, The expectation itself mattered. It reminded Greek states that shared worship could momentarily outweigh conflict. Even rivals stood together under Poseidon's gaze. Yet the god's presence carried anxiety as well as comfort. Poseidon was known for sudden wrath. Storms, earthquakes, and shipwrecks were read as signs of displeasure. The games, therefore, carried an undercurrent of urgency. Rituals had to be performed correctly. Offences could not be ignored. Mistakes risked more than embarrassment. The Isthmian Games were not entertainment dressed as religion. They were religion enacted through competition. Every race, song, and sacrifice unfolded beneath the awareness that the sea god was watching, and that his favour could lift a man, a city, or cast them suddenly down. Once the rituals were complete, the focus shifted to the athletes themselves. The Isthmian Games attracted competitors from across the Greek world, each arriving with months or years of preparation behind them. Training was intense and relentless. Athletes lived disciplined lives, shaping their bodies through repetitive drills, strict diets, and constant supervision. Victory at Corinth promised fame that travelled quickly along the same trade routes that fed the city. Events included foot races, wrestling, boxing, pankration, and chariot contests. These were not exhibitions. They were violent, exhausting tests of endurance and control. There were no second prizes. To lose was to disappear back into anonymity. To win was to have your name remembered, sometimes engraved in stone, sometimes repeated by poets and crowds. Unlike modern athletes, competitors were not amateurs in spirit, even if the prizes were symbolic. Wreaths of pine or later celery crowned the winners, but the real rewards followed afterward. Victorious athletes returned home to honours, public meals, financial rewards, and political influence. A win at the Isthmian Games could elevate an entire family. The games also reflected regional styles. Some cities became known for producing strong wrestlers, others for fast runners or skilled charioteers. These reputations mattered. Athletes did not compete as isolated individuals. They carried the pride and expectations of their cities with them. A loss could be embarrassing. A victory could be weaponized in diplomacy. The atmosphere was tense. Competitors trained in full view of spectators, watched by rivals and potential critics. Accusations of cheating were common. Bribery, illegal techniques, and unsportsmanlike behaviour existed, despite rules and judges. The games were sacred, but they were not innocent. Yet beneath the rivalry was shared understanding. Athletes recognised one another's suffering. Injuries were common. Broken bones, concussions, and permanent damage were accepted risks. To compete at Corinth meant accepting pain as part of devotion and ambition. The Isthmian Games celebrated physical excellence, but they also revealed something darker. Glory was fragile. One misstep, one stronger opponent, one unlucky moment could end everything. Still, athletes returned, driven by the hope that this time Poseidon would favour their strength, and the crowd would remember their name. The Isthmian Games were not only a contest of bodies, but of voices. Alongside athletes, poets, and musicians arrived in Corinth seeking recognition in a different arena. Performance was woven into the fabric of the festival, reinforcing the idea that excellence did not belong solely to physical strength. Song, rhythm, and verse mattered just as much. Musical competitions featured lyre players, flute performers, and singers who performed hymns to the gods or epic narratives drawn from myth and history. These performances were judged publicly, and like athletic events, they carried prestige. A skilled musician could gain lasting fame, especially if their performance pleased influential listeners. Music shaped the emotional rhythm of the festival, alternating between celebration, tension, and reverence. Poets used the games as an opportunity to test their work before large and diverse audiences. The Isthmian Games attracted people from across Greece, making them an ideal platform for spreading new verses. A successful poem could travel far beyond Corinth, repeated by listeners as they returned home. In this way, the games functioned as a cultural broadcasting centre long before writing reached mass audiences. Victory odes played a special role. Poets composed verses praising winning athletes, cities, and patrons. These odes elevated athletic success into moral and civic achievement, framing victory as proof of discipline, virtue, and divine favour. Fame did not end when the wreath was removed. It was preserved through words. The presence of poets also reinforced Corinth's status as a cultural hub. Wealthy patrons commissioned performances to enhance their reputation, turning art into a form of social currency. Applause mattered, but so did who was seen applauding. Artistic success, like athletic victory, depended on visibility. The soundscape of the Isthmian Games was constant and overwhelming. Cheers from the stadium blended with music, chanting, bargaining, and prayer. Sacred hymns echoed near Poseidon's sanctuary, while laughter and argument filled the surrounding grounds. Silence was rare. In this environment, performance was competitive by nature. Musicians and poets faced the same pressure as athletes: one chance to impress, little tolerance for failure, and no guarantee of reward. Yet they returned, driven by the same desire for recognition. The Isthmian Games proved that Greek competition extended beyond physical dominance. Excellence had many forms, and in Corinth, every voice competed to be heard. Beyond the stadiums and sanctuaries, another competition unfolded, quieter, louder, and far more profitable. The Isthmian Games were a commercial event as much as a sacred one. Wherever large crowds gathered in the ancient world, merchants followed, and Corinth's position between two seas made it an ideal marketplace. Temporary stalls filled the open spaces around the sanctuary. Traders sold food, wine, oil, textiles, tools, perfumes, and small luxury items aimed at visitors eager to spend. Artisans offered figurines of Poseidon, miniature wreaths, and souvenirs marking attendance at the games. Even athletes and performers became customers, purchasing supplies or commissioning equipment while they waited to compete. Money changed hands constantly. Wagers were placed on athletic events despite official disapproval. Betting added another layer of tension to competitions already charged with pride and honour. Victories could enrich not only athletes, but those who backed them. Losses stung just as deeply. Corinth benefited enormously from this activity. Hosting the games allowed the city to assert economic dominance while appearing generous and pious. Taxes, harbour fees, and lodging all fed into the city's wealth. Visitors needed ships repaired, animals housed, and supplies replenished. The games stimulated every layer of local industry. For merchants from other cities, the festival offered access to clients they might never otherwise meet. Trade agreements were discussed casually, contracts negotiated over shared meals, and alliances tested through conversation. The sacred setting encouraged trust, at least temporarily. Business conducted under Poseidon's gaze carried an implication of honesty, even if reality often fell short. The mingling of commerce and ritual disturbed some observers. Philosophers complained that profit distracted from piety. Moralists warned that greed polluted sacred space. Yet these criticisms rarely slowed activity. The games had always been entangled with trade, and Corinth embraced that identity unapologetically. Crowds moved constantly between spectacle and shopping. A wrestling match might end, sending spectators rushing toward food stalls or shaded tents. Poetic performances drew listeners who then drifted toward merchants selling writing tablets or scrolls. The entire festival pulsed with economic motion. The Isthmian Games revealed an essential truth about ancient Greek life. Religion, competition, and commerce were not separate worlds. They reinforced one another. Sacred celebration drew crowds. Crowds fueled trade. Trade strengthened the city that hosted the god. In Corinth, Poseidon was honoured not only with sacrifices and songs, but with thriving markets that proved his favour in unmistakable terms. The Isthmian Games brought together thousands of people who would otherwise never meet peacefully. Citizens of rival cities, soldiers on leave, sailors from distant ports, wealthy elites, and the poor all converged on the same sacred ground. The festival promised unity, but it also created tension. Where crowds gather, conflict follows. In theory, the games were protected by a sacred truce. Travelers were meant to pass safely, and hostilities were discouraged during the festival. This expectation allowed competitors and spectators from hostile states to stand side by side without immediate violence. The truce was not always formally declared, but the religious weight of Poseidon's sanctuary demanded restraint. In practice, restraint was fragile. Old grudges did not vanish simply because a festival had begun. Boasting, drunkenness, and wagers easily reignited rivalries. Arguments over athletic results or accusations of cheating could escalate quickly. Judges worked constantly to prevent disputes from turning physical. Crowd behavior played a major role. Victories were celebrated loudly, sometimes provocatively. Supporters shouted the names of their cities, turning personal wins into political statements. Defeats could spark resentment, especially if the outcome seemed unfair. The emotional intensity of competition magnified every slight. Security relied on social pressure rather than force. There was no standing police presence capable of controlling massive crowds. Instead, fear of offending the god, public shame, and the risk of collective retaliation kept most disputes contained. Violence did occur, but it was dangerous for all involved. Alcohol flowed freely. Wine dulled restraint and sharpened tempers. Nighttime gatherings, removed from the formal spaces of the sanctuary, were especially volatile. The line between celebration and chaos was thin. Yet despite these risks, the games rarely collapsed into full disorder. The shared recognition that this space was sacred mattered. People wanted the festival to continue. They wanted to return home safely. Mutual self-interest reinforced religious obligation. The Isthmian Games revealed how delicate peace could be in the ancient Greek world. Unity was possible but temporary. It required ritual, spectacle, and constant negotiation. For a few days, Poseidon's authority held rival cities in check. Once the crowds dispersed, old conflicts resumed, but the memory of standing together remained, however briefly. Over time, the Isthmian Games changed. As Greek political power fractured and new rulers emerged, the festival adapted rather than disappeared. Macedonian kings and later Roman authorities recognized the value of the games as a tool of influence. Control of the Isthmian Games meant access to Greek prestige, tradition, and public loyalty. Under Roman rule, the games continued largely intact. Romans understood spectacle. They supported the festival, funded repairs to sanctuaries, and sometimes presided over ceremonies. Participation expanded beyond the Greek world. Athletes, performers, and spectators arrived from across the empire, turning the Isthmian Games into an international event. This expansion altered the character of the festival. Competition intensified, but commercialization deepened. Wealthy patrons sponsored events to display generosity and secure public favor. Roman officials used the games as stages for announcements and political theater. Sacred tradition remained, but it shared space with imperial authority. Some Greeks viewed these changes with suspicion. They worried that Roman involvement diluted the religious seriousness of the festival. Others welcomed the stability and resources Rome provided. The games survived precisely because they could serve new masters without losing their core identity. The physical landscape evolved as well. Infrastructure improved. Roads, seating, and facilities expanded to accommodate larger crowds. Corinth itself was rebuilt and repopulated after Roman destruction, and the games played a role in restoring its prominence. Poseidon's sanctuary remained central, anchoring continuity amid transformation. Eventually, as Christianity spread and pagan festivals declined, the Isthmian Games faded. Without state support or religious centrality, they could not survive. Yet their influence endured. The idea of combining sport, culture, commerce, and identity in one grand event shaped later public festivals. The Isthmian Games remind us that the ancient world understood spectacle deeply. These were not simple athletic contests. They were instruments of unity, competition, diplomacy, and belief. Held between two seas, the games connected people across boundaries of city, language, and empire. Long after the cheers faded, the model remained. Wherever crowds gather to compete, celebrate, and trade under shared symbols, the spirit of Corinth's games lives on. What ultimately made the Isthmian Games important was not any single race, song, or sacrifice, but the way all of these elements merged into a shared experience. For the Greeks, the games were a reminder of who they were when divisions were temporarily set aside. City-states that fought bitter wars could still recognize one another as participants in the same sacred tradition. The Isthmian Games offered a controlled space for rivalry. Competition replaced warfare, at least briefly. Athletes battled instead of armies. Poets praised instead of propagandized. Even commerce softened conflict by binding rivals through shared profit. This did not end violence in the Greek world, but it provided an alternative language for prestige and honor. Memory played a crucial role. Victories were remembered long after the festival ended. Names of champions circulated through stories, inscriptions, and poetry. Cities remembered who triumphed and who failed. These memories shaped identity. A single victory could define a lifetime. A single disgrace could linger for generations. The games also taught lessons about order. Rules, judges, rituals, and sacred boundaries all reinforced the idea that competition required structure. Strength without restraint was dangerous. Skill without respect for the gods was meaningless. The festival balanced chaos and control, reminding participants that excellence demanded discipline. For Corinth, the games became part of civic identity. Hosting the Isthmian Games declared the city's importance to the Greek world. Even after political fortunes shifted, the memory of the festival reinforced Corinth's role as a meeting point of cultures, trade, and ideas. In later centuries, writers looked back on the Isthmian Games as symbols of a shared past. They represented a time when Greek identity was expressed not through conquest alone, but through excellence, creativity, and ritual. The games were idealized, even as their realities were forgotten. What survived was the idea that large gatherings could shape culture, that sport, art, and belief could reinforce one another. That shared spectacle could momentarily overcome division. The Isthmian Games mattered because they revealed how ancient societies understood power, not only through force, but through participation. To attend was to belong. To compete was to be seen. And for a brief moment between two seas, the Greek world gathered to watch itself perform. The end of the Isthmian Games did not arrive with a final trumpet or a remembered champion. It came quietly, as traditions often do, worn down rather than destroyed. As the ancient world changed, the foundations that had sustained the games slowly eroded. Religion, politics, and public life no longer aligned in the way they once had. The greatest shift was religious. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, festivals dedicated to the old gods lost their meaning and protection. Poseidon's sanctuary, once alive with sacrifice and song, became an artifact of a fading belief system. Without the god at the center, the games lost their sacred authority. Competition without divine purpose felt hollow, even dangerous, to a new religious order. State support disappeared as well. Roman officials who had once sponsored and exploited the games for prestige now turned their attention elsewhere. Resources were redirected. Infrastructure decayed. Without money, organization, and official endorsement, large gatherings became difficult to sustain. The crowds stopped coming. Cultural memory lingered longer than the festival itself. Writers referenced the Isthmian Games as symbols of an earlier age, a time when cities met in competition rather than constant war. Victories were still remembered, even when the stadium stood empty. The idea of the games outlived the reality. The silence that followed was profound. A space once filled with shouting crowds, music, bargaining, and prayer returned to quiet. Pine trees grew where spectators once gathered. Stone structures weathered. The movement that had defined the isthmus slowed, though it never truly stopped. Yet disappearance does not mean failure. The Isthmian Games succeeded precisely because they were not eternal. They reflected the values of their time: belief in the gods, pride in the body, respect for skill, and fascination with public spectacle. When those values changed, the Games no longer belonged. What remains is influence. Modern sporting events, festivals, and international competitions still echo the Isthmian model. The blending of sport, culture, commerce, and identity continues. Crowds still gather for shared experience. Cities still seek prestige through spectacle. The Isthmian Games ended, but their purpose did not vanish. They remind us that civilizations express themselves not only through laws and wars, but through the moments when they come together to compete, celebrate, and be seen, if only for a little while. For the Romans, wine was not an indulgence reserved for celebration. It was a constant presence, woven into daily routine, religious ritual, and social identity. Soldiers received wine as part of their rations. Labourers drank it to dull exhaustion. Elites discussed it with the seriousness usually reserved for politics. Even children encountered wine early, heavily diluted with water, learning its taste long before adulthood. To live in the Roman world was to live surrounded by wine. Rome did not invent winemaking, but it transformed it into an imperial system. Wherever Roman power expanded, vines followed. Veterans were settled on conquered land and encouraged to plant vineyards. Provinces were reshaped not only by roads and forts, but by trellised hillsides and cultivated valleys. From the cooler regions of Gaul to the sun-baked landscapes of Syria, Roman viticulture adapted to local conditions while imposing standardized practices. Wine became a marker of Roman presence. If wine was being produced, Rome had arrived. This expansion was supported by careful observation. Roman agricultural writers treated viticulture as a technical discipline. They recorded soil quality, slope orientation, pruning schedules, and harvest timing with meticulous attention. Different grape varieties were matched to different climates. Failures were analysed, successes were copied. Wine was not left to chance. It was engineered. Wine also functioned as a social signal. Quality mattered. A host's reputation could rise or fall based on the wine poured at dinner. Serving an aged vintage demonstrated wealth and patience. Serving cheap or poorly stored wine suggested carelessness or insult. Even among ordinary Romans, preferences existed. Not all wine was equal, and everyone had opinions. Yet despite this obsession, Roman attitudes toward wine emphasized control. Drinking wine undiluted was considered barbaric. To consume it straight was to surrender reason. Proper Romans mixed wine with water, balancing pleasure and restraint. Excess was mocked and feared, even if it was practiced quietly. This contradiction defined Roman wine culture. Wine was everywhere, deeply loved and endlessly discussed, yet always surrounded by rules. It was both a daily necessity and a moral test. In mastering wine, Romans believed they demonstrated mastery over themselves, their land, and the vast empire that carried their vineyards from one horizon to the next. Once wine became central to Roman life, controlling its production became a matter of imperial importance. Vineyards were not planted randomly. They followed expansion, settlement, and strategy. Land granted to veterans was often ideal for viticulture, ensuring both economic stability and cultural continuity. A province that produced wine could support itself and export surplus back into Roman trade networks. Romans studied land carefully before planting vines. Hillsides were preferred, especially those with good sun exposure and natural drainage. Soil was tested by touch and smell. Poor land might grow grain, but good land grew vines. Vineyards demanded patience. Years passed before full production began, and only stable regions could sustain that investment. This made viticulture a quiet declaration of long-term control. Different regions developed reputations. Wines from Italy were prized, especially those from Campania and Latium. Over time, provincial wines from Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa gained recognition. Success was not immediate. Early provincial wines were mocked as crude, but Roman methods improved them. Pruning techniques, grafting and selective harvesting raised quality steadily. Labour was relentless. Vineyards required constant attention. Slaves performed much of the work, supervised by estate managers who tracked yields obsessively. Seasonal rhythms ruled life, pruning in winter, training in spring, harvest in autumn. Mistakes ruined entire vintages. Discipline mattered. Wine production also encouraged infrastructure. Roads connected estates to ports. Storage facilities multiplied. Amphora workshops appeared near vineyards, producing containers designed for transport. Every stage of production fed the economy. Wine became one of Rome's most valuable commodities, moving in vast quantities across the Mediterranean. Yet expansion carried risks. Overproduction threatened grain supply. Some emperors restricted new vineyards, fearing farmers would abandon food crops. These laws reveal how widespread viticulture had become. Wine was profitable, but grain was essential. By the height of the empire, vineyards formed a web that mirrored Roman authority. To drink wine in a distant province was to participate in a system shaped by Roman planning, labour, and control. Wine travelled where legions had gone, and its presence confirmed that Roman order had taken root deeply enough to grow something that required patience, stability, and time. When harvest season arrived, vineyards became sites of intense activity. Timing mattered more than force. Grapes harvested too early produced sharp, thin wine. Grapes left too long risked rot or loss to birds. Estate managers watched the vines carefully, judging readiness by colour, sweetness, and texture. The decision to harvest was irreversible. Once grapes were cut, the year's work was locked in. Harvesting was manual and exhausting. Workers cut grape clusters by hand, piling them into baskets and carrying them to pressing areas. Speed mattered. Grapes spoiled quickly once detached from the vine. Pressing often began the same day, sometimes immediately in the fields. Pressing was done with feet or wooden presses. Workers crushed grapes in shallow vats, allowing juice to flow into collection basins. This first pressing produced the best wine. Later pressings, involving heavier pressure, yielded lower quality liquid used for everyday consumption or for slaves. Nothing was wasted. Fermentation occurred naturally. Yeast present on grape skins transformed sugar into alcohol without scientific understanding, but Roman vintners recognized patterns. Temperature mattered. Containers were kept in cool, shaded areas. Frothing signaled success. Off smells warned of failure. Winemaking required experience more than theory. Juice was transferred into large clay containers, often buried partially in the ground to regulate temperature. These vessels allowed slow fermentation and settling. Sediment sank to the bottom, clarifying the liquid above. Vintners tasted regularly, adjusting methods when possible. The process was risky. Entire harvests could spoil. Mould, excessive heat, or contamination ruined wine. Failure meant economic loss and social embarrassment. Success meant reputation and profit. Harvest time was also social. Songs, prayers, and offerings accompanied the work. Winemaking blended labour with ritual. The gods were thanked before and after, reinforcing the belief that human effort alone was not enough. Roman wine was not refined by modern standards. It was rough, variable, and deeply influenced by environment. Yet it was the product of immense labour and accumulated knowledge. Each cup represented months of attention and years of experience. Behind every amphora stood hands stained with juice, feet purple from pressing, and a system that turned fragile fruit into a substance that defined Roman life. Once fermentation settled, wine entered its longest and most uncertain phase: storage. Romans did not bottle wine as we know it. Instead, they relied on clay amphorae, tall ceramic vessels sealed with resin or pitch. These containers shaped how wine tasted, aged, and survived transport across the empire. Amphorae were porous. Air slowly passed through their walls, allowing wine to change over time. This made aging possible but unpredictable. Some wines improved with age, developing complexity and smoothness. Others turned sour or spoiled. Aging was an experiment repeated year after year, guided by memory rather than measurement. To control this process, amphorae were often stored in cool cellars or partially buried in the ground. Sealing was crucial. Resin, wax, or oil prevented excessive oxidation and contamination. The smell of pitch became associated with wine itself, influencing taste. Roman wine rarely tasted clean by modern standards. It carried earthy, smoky, and sometimes medicinal notes. Labels were scratched or painted onto amphorae. They recorded the estate, vintage, and sometimes the consul in office that year. This allowed wines to be dated and compared. Aged wine became a status symbol. Serving an old vintage demonstrated wealth, storage capacity, and patience. Time itself became a luxury. Transportation posed further challenges. Amphorae were stacked tightly in ships' holds, secured with ropes and clay. Breakage was common. Leaks ruined cargo. Shipwrecks scattered amphorae across the sea floor, where many still lie today. Wine was valuable, but fragile. Different wines aged differently. Some were meant to be consumed quickly. Others improved over decades. Roman writers debated ideal aging times passionately. Opinions varied, but consensus existed that skill and luck mattered equally. Aging also blurred the line between wine and medicine. Older wines were believed to have health benefits. They were prescribed for digestion, wounds, and fevers. Taste mattered less than effect. Through amphorae, wine became a traveller. It carried regional flavours across vast distances. It allowed a drinker in Rome to taste Hispania, Gaul, or the eastern provinces. Wine aged not only in clay, but in motion, shaped by time, transport, and chance. In Roman hands, aging was less about perfection than transformation. Amphorae captured wine at one moment and released it years later as something changed, unpredictable, prized, and inseparable from the empire that carried it. Roman wine rarely tasted the way modern drinkers expect. Pure grape flavour was not the goal. Instead, Romans treated wine as a base, something to be shaped, improved, and corrected. Flavouring was common, deliberate, and deeply tied to Roman ideas of taste, medicine, and status. Honey was the most popular additive. Mixed with wine, it created mulsum, a sweet drink often served at the beginning of meals. Honey softened harsh flavours and made young or poor quality wine more pleasant. Serving mulsum signalled hospitality and refinement. It was not considered cheating, it was considered skill. Herbs and spices followed. Rosemary, thyme, bay leaves, cinnamon, pepper, and even saffron appeared in recipes. Some were added for flavour, others for supposed health benefits. Wine was believed to carry medicinal properties, and additives enhanced its effects. A spiced wine might aid digestion, warm the body, or strengthen vitality. Taste and therapy overlapped. More surprising ingredients existed as well. Seawater was sometimes added deliberately. This stabilized wine and altered flavour, giving it a sharp mineral edge. To Roman palates, this was not strange. It reflected the empire's maritime identity. Salt preserved, seawater corrected imbalance. What sounds unpleasant today was once sophisticated. Resin, already present from amphora seals, became part of the flavour profile. Rather than remove it, Romans embraced it. The line between storage artifact and intended taste was thin. Wine absorbed its container, its environment, and its treatment. Experimentation was constant. Estate owners guarded recipes. Success brought reputation. Failure brought ridicule. Taste was subjective, but consensus formed around what was fashionable. Trends shifted. What one generation admired, the next mocked. Quality mattered. Flavouring could improve mediocre wine, but excessive manipulation signalled low status. The elite claimed to prefer subtle enhancement, even when indulging heavily. Moderation was praised, even if rarely practiced. These practices reveal something essential about Roman culture. Wine was not sacred in its raw state. It was meant to be worked, adjusted, and perfected through human intervention. Nature provided grapes. Romans provided order. In shaping wine's taste, Romans expressed their broader worldview. Civilization meant control, refinement meant improvement, and wine, endlessly altered and debated, became a canvas for Roman identity, layered, ambitious, and never satisfied with leaving things as they were. Despite their enthusiasm for wine, Romans believed firmly that how one drank mattered more than how much. Drinking wine undiluted was considered dangerous, uncivilized, and morally suspect. To consume wine straight was associated with foreigners, especially Greeks of poor reputation and northern barbarians. A proper Roman always mixed wine with water. Dilution took place at the table. Wine was poured into a large mixing bowl, the crater, and water was added according to custom and context. Ratios varied. Stronger mixes were used at banquets as the evening progressed, but pure wine remained unacceptable. Moderation was not merely social etiquette, it was proof of self-mastery. This belief shaped Roman identity. Romans admired discipline and control. Wine tested both. A man who lost control while drinking revealed weakness of character. Public drunkenness invited ridicule and damaged reputation. Excess was tolerated privately, but condemned publicly. The ideal Roman drank deeply, without surrendering authority over speech or behaviour. Symposia and banquets followed structured drinking patterns. Toasts were offered to gods, ancestors, or political figures. Conversation guided the pace. Games determined who drank next. These rituals imposed order on indulgence. Wine loosened tongues, but ritual restrained chaos. Women faced stricter expectations. Respectable women were expected to drink little or not at all. Stories circulated of women punished for drinking wine, reflecting anxiety about female independence. Wine symbolized freedom, and freedom was closely monitored, yet contradictions persisted. Roman literature is filled with tales of drunken emperors, senators, and generals. Satire mocked hypocrisy. Moralists complained endlessly, suggesting the problem was widespread. The rules existed precisely because they were often broken. Dilution also had practical benefits. Roman wine was strong, unstable, and sometimes harsh. Water softened flavour and reduced spoilage. It made wine safer to drink daily. Control aligned with convenience. Ultimately, Roman drinking culture reveals a society obsessed with balance. Wine was essential, pleasurable, and respected, but also feared. It blurred boundaries between reason and excess. By diluting wine, Romans symbolically diluted danger itself. To drink like a Roman was to walk a line, enjoying abundance without surrendering discipline. The cup was never just a cup. It was a test of character, culture, and control in liquid form. Wine in Roman society was never just about taste. It was a performance, carefully staged to communicate status, generosity, and cultural literacy. What you served, how you served it, and to whom all mattered. A Roman dinner was a public statement, even when held behind closed doors. Elite hosts used wine to display refinement. Serving aged vintages signalled wealth and patience. Offering rare regional wines demonstrated access to trade networks and influence. Even the order in which wines appeared mattered. Cheaper or sweeter wines often opened the meal, while stronger or more prestigious ones followed. Guests noticed. They always noticed. Tableware reinforced these signals. Fine cups, decorated mixing bowls, and elegant ladles elevated the experience. Slaves trained specifically for wine service managed dilution, temperature, and timing. Smooth service reflected well on the host. Mistakes suggested disorder. Conversation flowed with the wine. Poetry was recited. Politics were debated. Alliances were tested. Wine loosened tongues just enough to reveal character without erasing restraint. A guest who drank too eagerly embarrassed himself. One who refused entirely appeared arrogant. Knowing the rhythm was essential. Lower classes participated differently. Tavern wine was cheaper, harsher, and often flavoured heavily to mask flaws. Drinking here was louder, less restrained, and more communal. Respectability mattered less than escape. Yet even in taverns, reputation followed behaviour. Wine exposed who you were. Wine also marked moments of transition. Weddings, funerals, military victories and religious festivals all involved drinking. Each context carried its own expectations. A funeral demanded restraint. A triumph allowed excess. Knowing the difference was part of Roman education. For freedmen and social climbers, wine offered opportunity. Hosting dinners allowed them to imitate elite customs, though mistakes were mercilessly mocked. Satirists delighted in exposing pretension through wine faux pas. Status could be displayed, but never easily acquired. In Rome, wine did not erase hierarchy. It emphasized it. Every cup carried meaning beyond flavor. To drink was to participate in a coded language of power, manners, and identity. Wine flowed everywhere in Roman life, but it never flowed freely. Each sip reinforced who belonged, who aspired, and who fell short. Beyond pleasure and status, Romans believed wine played a direct role in maintaining health. Medical writers treated wine as a powerful substance that could heal or harm depending on how it was used. It was not simply a drink. It was a form of treatment, regulated by age, season, temperament, and condition of the body. Roman medicine was rooted in balance. Health depended on maintaining harmony between bodily qualities like heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Wine, considered warming and drying, could restore balance when used correctly. Diluted wine aided digestion, stimulated appetite, and improved circulation. For the elderly, it was thought to restore vitality. For the sick, it could strengthen or weaken depending on dosage. Doctors prescribed specific wines for specific ailments. Light wines were recommended for fevers. Stronger, aged wines were used for wounds, fatigue, and digestive problems. Wine mixed with herbs treated everything from stomach pain to insomnia. Even mental health was addressed through controlled drinking. Believed to ease anxiety and melancholy, water alone was considered unsafe in many regions. Contamination was common. Mixing water with wine made it safer to consume daily. In this sense, wine protected the population, especially in cities. Drinking diluted wine was practical as well as cultural. Yet Roman physicians warned constantly against excess. Overindulgence overheated the body, weakened reason, and damaged internal organs. Chronic drunkenness was linked to madness and moral decay. Wine was powerful medicine, and like all medicine, dangerous in the wrong hands. Age and gender shaped recommendations. Young men were urged to drink moderately to avoid reckless behavior. Older men were encouraged to drink more freely to maintain strength. Women were advised caution, reinforcing broader social controls. Children received wine diluted heavily, more symbol than substance. Seasonal guidance mattered too. More wine in winter, less in summer. Cold weather demanded warmth. Heat required restraint. Even time of day influenced advice. Drinking early was frowned upon. Drinking late was tolerated. These beliefs reveal a Roman view of the body as something to be managed carefully. Wine was neither good nor bad. It was potent. To drink well was to understand yourself. In Roman thought, health was not achieved by avoidance, but by mastery. Wine fit perfectly into this worldview, dangerous if abused, beneficial if controlled. It embodied the Roman ideal of disciplined enjoyment, where pleasure served the body rather than ruling it. When Roman political power collapsed in the West, wine did not disappear. Vineyards outlived emperors, and Roman viticultural knowledge proved remarkably durable. Roads fell into disrepair, cities shrank, but vines continued to grow on hillsides planted centuries earlier. Wine endured because it had become embedded in daily life, agriculture, and belief. Christianity reshaped wine's meaning rather than rejecting it. Wine moved from banquet hall to altar, transformed into a sacred symbol through the Eucharist. Roman techniques of cultivation, storage, and dilution carried into monastic communities, where monks preserved and refined winemaking practices. Vineyards became centers of stability in a fractured world. In the Eastern Empire, Roman traditions continued almost uninterrupted. Wine remained essential to diet, medicine, and trade. In the West, regional styles evolved, but the foundations were Roman. Grape varieties, vineyard layouts, and fermentation methods all traced back to imperial experimentation. The idea that wine should be moderated survived as well. Medieval writers echoed Roman warnings against excess. Drinking wine diluted or spiced remained common. The moral language around wine, pleasure tempered by restraint, was inherited directly from Roman culture. Modern wine culture still bears Roman fingerprints. The spread of vineyards across Europe follows Roman roots. The concept of terroir, matching soil and climate to grape, echoes Roman observation. Aging wine, labelling by vintage, and treating wine as both daily drink and luxury all have Roman precedents. Even the act of watering wine, once universal, lingers symbolically in customs and rituals. Though modern drinkers prefer purity, the Roman belief that wine is something to be managed rather than consumed blindly remains influential. Roman wine was not refined by modern standards. It was often rough, flavoured, and unpredictable. Yet its importance was unmatched. Wine shaped landscapes, economies, and social life across an empire. In the end, Roman winemaking was about control, over nature, over the body, and over culture. The vine became a tool of civilization. Long after Rome's fall, its vineyards continued to produce, quietly preserving an imperial legacy one cup at a time.